The wind howled through the dusty streets of a small Alabama town, where wooden houses stood precariously like ghosts in the night. The March storm of 2025 did not arrive gently. It roared, tearing off loose metal sheets, toppling brittle branches, and carrying a chaotic symphony as if nature itself was screaming in fury. In an old wooden house at the end of a narrow alley, David, a black man who had lived 6 decades in this land, huddled in his worn-out armchair, his frail hands clutching a thin blanket. The dim oil lamp on the table flickered, swaying with the wind seeping through cracks in the walls, as if to remind him that loneliness was not just a feeling, but a living entity clinging to him every day. David had not always been alone. He once had a family, a gentle wife named Ella, who sang old hymns every Sunday morning, and 2 children who had long left the town to seek better lives in Atlanta. Ella had passed away 10 years ago, leaving David with only memories and an increasingly empty home. The white neighbors around him, who had never truly welcomed him, now merely cast cold glances or ignored him altogether, as if he were invisible. The old black man, that's what they called him, not out of respect for his age, but as a label, a way to push him further to the margins. In Alabama, David's skin color was not just a characteristic. It was a barrier, a reminder that he would never truly belong here, despite being born and raised on this very land. Tonight, the storm made everything worse. The wind's howls mixed with the rain hammering against the roof, forming a chaotic symphony that made sleep impossible. David rose from his chair, his aching legs carrying him to the window. He peered through the darkness outside, his cloudy eyes straining against the rain, but all he saw was blackness and water streaking across the glass. He sighed and turned back to his chair, but just then another sound cut through the storm, a deafening crash, as if the heavens themselves had split apart. David's heart pounded. That wasn't thunder. It was closer, more real, coming from the road near his house. With trembling hands, David grabbed an old flashlight from the table, a relic from his decades working a steel factory. He opened the door, letting the cold wind whip against his face, and stepped onto the porch. The rain lashed at him like needles, soaking through his thin clothes, but he didn't care. He had to know what was happening. Through the thick downpour, he saw a tall figure struggling with something in the road, a fallen tree, its massive trunk crushing a white pickup truck that was now trapped beneath it. The man, though obscured by rain, was unmistakably black, with broad shoulders and a determined stance against the storm. David squinted and recognized him. Alone Jackson, a construction engineer he had heard about in town, always mentioned in hushed, disdainful tones. That new black guy. Who does he think he is? Alone was not from Alabama. He had moved here from Mississippi a few years back, carrying dreams of building a better life with his own hands in mind. But in this town, he was not just a stranger. He was a black stranger, and that alone made him a target for suspicion and scorn. "What the hell are you doing here?" Lurking around. A white man had once barked at him when he was repairing power lines after another storm. Alone had not responded, only bowing his head and working. But inside, the injustice burned like an unextinguished flame. Tonight, he had no intention of walking away when he saw the trapped truck, not because he knew who was inside, but because he knew that if no one acted, no one else would. David stood on the porch, gripping his flashlight as he watched Alone wrestle with the rain-soaked branches. The sound of wood scraping against metal echoed sharply through the storm, mingling with the pounding rain and Alone's heavy breaths. A strange feeling rose in David's chest, admiration mixed with fear. He knew this town was not kind to men like Alone, nor to men like himself. Then a faint sound came from the truck, someone trapped inside, weakly pounding against the glass in desperation. Without thinking, David called out over the storm, "Do you need help?" His voice was hoarse with cold, but loud enough for Alone to hear. Alone turned, his rain-slicked face illuminated by the weak glow of David's flashlight. He was surprised to see the old black man standing there, shivering in the rain, yet stepping forward. "Thank you," Alone shouted back, his deep voice steady despite the storm. "But go inside, it's dangerous." David shook his head, though his legs barely held against the cold. He stepped closer, raising his flashlight higher to give Alone a clearer view. The light flickered over Alone's face, bright eyes, clenched teeth from exertion, and a faint scar on his forehead that David had never noticed before. In that moment, amid the storm, the two black men, one old, one young, became unexpected allies, standing together against both nature and the isolation imposed by this town. But the brief moment of solidarity did not last. As Alone heaved a massive branch from the truck, a group of figures emerged from the alley, stepping through the rain with menacing strides. David recognized them immediately. The young white men he often saw gathering at the town's bar, led by Jake, a hulking brute whose eyes always burned with hatred. They weren't here because of the storm, nor to help. They were here for Alone. "What the hell are you doing here, boy?" Jake snarled, his voice cutting through the rain. He stepped forward, gripping a baseball bat, water streaming down his flushed face. One of the others sneered and pointed at David. "And the old man, too? You sticking up for him?" David felt his blood freeze. He had heard these words too many times before, from white men in town, from the disdainful looks in the grocery store, from the whispered comments behind his back at the park bench. Black men don't belong here. They never said it outright, but their actions screamed it every day. And now, in this storm, the hostility was more tangible than ever. Alone straightened, though his hands still gripped the tree branch, his eyes locked onto Jake. "I'm saving someone," he said, his voice like steel. "What do you want?" Jake laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was one of contempt of the power he believed he held. "Saving someone?" He mocked. "You think you're a hero? There's no place for you here." He stepped closer, swinging the bat slightly in his grip. David instinctively stepped back, but Alone didn't flinch. He set the branch down and squared his shoulders, his stance unyielding. "If you're not here to help, step aside," Alone said, his voice calm, yet unwavering. Jake's gang murmured, one of them shouting, "Take the old man too." They belonged together. Laughter erupted, but it was quickly drowned by the rain. David's heart pounded, not from fear for himself, but because he knew what happened when black men stood their ground in Alabama. He had seen it too many times. Confrontations like these rarely ended peacefully. But Alone didn't waver. He turned to David and murmured through the wind, "Go inside. I've got this." David wanted to stay, wanted to say something, but his legs betrayed him. He shuffled back to the porch, still gripping the flashlight, its weak glow illuminating Alone's back. A lone black man standing against the crowd's hatred. As David shut the door, he heard Jake snarl again, but the storm drowned out whatever came next. He sank into his chair, his breath heavy, his mind racing. Alone was out there, fighting not just the fallen tree and the wrecked truck, but the deep-rooted prejudice of a town that had never welcomed them. David didn't know if Alone would win tonight, but he knew one thing. In this storm, for the first time in years, he was not alone. Someone had seen him, had acknowledged him, even if only for a fleeting moment. And that, to David, was a rare light in the darkness. The old wooden door closed behind David with a faint click, but the sound wasn't enough to drown out the roaring rain outside or the pounding of his heart in his chest. He leaned against the wall, his breath short and rapid, his hands still gripping the flashlight, as if it were the last thread connecting him to the world beyond the door. where Alone Jackson, the black man he had only briefly met, was facing Jake's gang. David couldn't see what was happening, but he heard Jake shout, sharp and dripping with hatred, cutting through the wind. "Who do you think you are, you black bastard?" The crowd's mocking laughter rose like an evil chorus, sending a shiver down David's spine. He knew all too well the cost of being black in this Alabama, and alone, no matter how strong, was just one man alone in a storm, both literal and figurative. Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, turning the narrow road into a muddy river. Alone stood tall, his sturdy hands lowering the branch he had just pulled from the white delivery truck. The light from David's flashlight had gone out, but the dim glow from the truck illuminated his face, his eyes blazing, his teeth clenched, and a streak of rainwater running down the small scar on his forehead. He didn't raise his voice to answer Jake or let his anger show. Instead, he turned back to the truck where the delivery man, a middle-aged white man with a face pale from fear, was banging on the glass in desperation. "Help me!" the man yelled, his voice cracking through the rain. Alone nodded without hesitation and bent down to continue pulling the remaining debris from the truck's wheel. Jake and his crew never took their eyes off Alone. They formed a loose semicircle, 5 white men with faces flushed from liquor and arrogance. Jake, the tallest of them, took a step forward, the baseball bat in his hand, swinging like a silent threat. "Didn't you hear me?" he growled, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "There's no place here for your kind. Playing hero won't do you any good." Another man, his blonde hair plastered with rain, laughed loudly. "Yeah, save that guy, and then what? He won't even thank you, black boy." Their laughter echoed, but Alone didn't look up. He focused on his task, his powerful hands yanking each branch free, steadily freeing the truck from the wreckage. David, inside the house, couldn't bear his own silence any longer. He cracked the door open just enough to peek through the narrow gap. He saw Alone's back, steady as a mountain in the storm, and Jake's gang, menacing figures inching closer. He wanted to shout, to run out and help Alone, but his legs trembled and memories of past confrontations with hatred flooded back like a tidal wave. He remembered being beaten by a group of white men behind the church just for daring to meet their eyes when he was young. He recalled their mocking laughter as he fell into the mud and the silence of the bystanders, none daring to speak up. Now, Alone stood there alone, and David felt that old fear return, mingling with helplessness. But Alone wasn't afraid. He wasn't one to pick fights, but he also wasn't one to bow to injustice. Back in Mississippi, he had watched his father get chased out of the store just for asking the price of an item, and his mother cry silently as they left. From that day, Alone had vowed not to let his skin color define him, no matter how hard the world tried. In this Alabama, he'd heard enough insults. "Where'd you come from, black boy? Don't stir trouble here." But tonight, when someone needed help, he couldn't stand by. He yanked one final branch free, hearing the crack as it broke away from the wheel, and the truck shuddered as if liberated. The deliverman inside pounded the door harder, and Alone rushed over, using his shoulder to shove the jammed door. With a piercing creak, it swung open, and the man scrambled out, gasping for air. Thank you," he stammered, his trembling hands briefly clutching Alone's shoulder before he bolted into the darkness, seeking shelter. Alone didn't have time to respond. He turned to face Jake, who now stood just a few steps away, bat raised like he was ready to strike. "See that?" Jake sneered, his voice quieter but still venomous. He ran off. "Nobody needs you here." The men behind him nodded, one shouting, "Yeah, go back where you belong. Stop hanging around." Alone stood still, rain streaming down his face, but his gaze didn't waver from Jake. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and steady. If someone needs help, I'll stay. Those words cut into Jake's pride like a knife, darkening his face. He stepped closer, bat raised high, and in that moment, David shouted from the house, "Stop!" David's cry was frail against the storm, but it was enough to make Jake pause. He turned, spotting the old black man at the door, hands shaking but eyes resolute. "What's this old man want?" One of Jake's crew laughed. "Defending him? You two make quite a pair." The laughter rang out again, but David didn't back down. He stepped onto the porch, rain lashing his face and making him cough. "He saved someone," David said, his voice hoarse but clear. "Can't you see that? Leave him alone." Jake turned fully, his gaze shifting from alone to David, then back to alone. "This old man's sticking up for you," he said mockingly. "But I don't care. Here, we decide who stays and who goes." He raised the bat, and the men behind him advanced, circling alone like a pack of hungry wolves. David's heart clenched. He knew what was coming. He'd seen these scenes in nightmares, in memories, and now it was unfolding before his eyes. But Alone didn't flinch. He stood tall, fists clenched, ready to face whatever came. "You want to hit me?" Alone asked, his voice eerily calm. "Go ahead, but I'm not leaving." The resolve in his words made Jake hesitate, if only for a second. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a black man he deemed out of place. His crew murmured, one yelling, "Take him down, Jake." But then a faint car horn sounded in the distance, weak but enough to cut through the tension. Another vehicle was approaching. Perhaps someone from town had heard the commotion. Jake gritted his teeth, lowering the bat, though his eyes still burned with hatred. "You got lucky," he snarled. "But this isn't over." The gang retreated, vanishing into the rain, leaving Alone standing alone by the now empty truck. He exhaled, his breath mingling with the cold air, then turned to David, still on the porch. "You okay?" Alone asked, his tone softening. David nodded, though tears mixed with the rain on his face. "Thank you," he said, voice trembling. "You didn't have to do that." Alone gave a faint smile, weary yet resilient. "I could not do it," he replied. "Go inside. I'll be back." As Alone walked off, his figure blending into the night, David closed the door, but this time he didn't feel alone. Out there, amid the storm and hatred, someone had stood up for him, and for the humanity this town seemed to have forgotten. But he also knew, as Jake had said, this wasn't over, and Alone, that brave man, was stepping into a fight bigger than he could imagine. The storm gradually subsided as the final hours of the night passed, leaving the small Alabama town in a heavy silence, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath after what had just transpired. David sat in his wooden house, his trembling hands still clutching the now-dead flashlight, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting a sound. Alone's footsteps returning, or the growls of Jake and his crew. But there was only the patter of rain on the roof and the whistle of wind through the cracks, a reminder that this peace was only temporary. He couldn't erase the image of Alone standing there, alone amidst the storm and the hostile crowd, with broad shoulders and unwavering eyes. Alone's compassion had saved the Deliverman, and perhaps David too, but he knew the cost of such kindness in a place like this was far from cheap. David stood, shuffling to the window, peering out at the now deserted road. The white delivery truck still sat there, tilted beside a pile of fallen branches, a silent witness to the night's events. He wondered where Alone had gone after Jake's gang retreated. Alone had said he'd return, but David wasn't sure if he really would. Not because Alone wouldn't keep his word, but because he knew what this town could do to people like them. He'd lived long enough to understand that a black man's kindness, no matter how noble, was often viewed through a lens of suspicion and hatred in Alabama. You don't belong here. Jake's words echoed in his mind, cutting into old wounds he'd tried to bury. A few blocks away, in a dilapidated shed reeking of motor oil and rotting wood, Jake stood among his crew, the light from a flashlight hanging on the wall, casting a glow on his flushed face. He slammed his baseball bat onto the floor, the loud thud startling the others. Did you see the way that black bastard looked at me? Jake snarled, his eyes flashing with rage. He thinks he can stand there, defying me, in front of this whole damn town. The blond guy, still soaked from the rain, sneered. And that old man David, too, thinking he's something for yelling at you? Laughter erupted in the shed, but Jake didn't join in. He gripped the bat tighter, his knuckles whitening with fury. Jake wasn't a nobody in this town. He'd grown up in a poor white family where his father had taught him that black people were a threat, and his mother whispered venomous words whenever they passed by on the street. To Jake, Alone's presence, a black man not only living here but daring to act like he belonged, was a personal insult. And David, the quiet old man at the end of the alley, had now become part of that insult by speaking up for Alone. They think they can stir things up here, Jake said, his voice dropping but laced with menace. I'll show them their place. Another guy, Billy, stepped forward, holding an old gasoline can. What do you mean, Jake? He asked, though his eyes gleamed as if he already knew what was coming. Jake turned, a cold smile spreading across his face. David's house, he said slowly. Burn it. Let's see if that Alone still dares to hang around here. Murmurs rippled through the group. Some nodded eagerly, others hesitated. But what if we get caught? A feeble voice piped up from the corner of the shed. Jake whipped around, his gaze sharp as a blade. Who dare catch me? He roared. The cops here know who I am. Besides, who cares about an old black man and some newcomer? The plan took shape in the shed's darkness, under the flickering light of the flashlight. Jake and his crew would wait until the next morning, when the town was still weary from the storm, to strike. Just a small fire, Jake said, stroking the bat like it was a prized possession. Enough to scare them into leaving. The group nodded, soft laughter rising, but there was a chill in the air they didn't even notice. The chill of a hatred so ingrained it had turned them into men willing to destroy lives just to preserve the town's so-called order. Meanwhile, David sat in his house, oblivious to the plot forming against him. He set the flashlight on the table and pulled an old photo from a drawer, a picture of him and Ella on their wedding day, both beaming under the Alabama sun. He brushed his fingers over Ella's face, whispering, I don't know how much longer I can take this, darling. A sudden bark from the yard startled him. He stood and peered out the window, but saw only darkness and lingering raindrops. The barking grew fiercer, as if his old mutt, Duke, a stray he'd taken in years ago, sensed something David couldn't see. David opened the door, calling Duke, come here. But the dog didn't return. It stood at the yard's edge, hackles raised, growling into the dark. A chill ran down David's spine. He wasn't superstitious, but he'd lived long enough to trust his instincts. And tonight, they were screaming that something was wrong. He shut the door, locking it carefully, but the unease didn't fade. He thought of Alone, the man who'd stood up for him, and wondered if he was safe. He didn't know that a few streets away, Alone was in a small motel room, phone in hand, voice urgent. I need your help, right now. Alone hadn't gone home after leaving David's. He knew Jake and his crew wouldn't stop after their confrontation. He'd seen the look in Jake's eyes, a wicked glint he recognized from men willing to do anything to assert their power. He called Marcus, a black friend who'd worked with him at the local charity Alabama Community Aid. Marcus, groggy over the phone, asked, What's going on this late, Alone? But as Alone recounted the night, the truck, the standoff with Jake, the unspoken threat he felt, Marcus's tone sharpened. You mean Jake? That guy doesn't mess around. He once smashed a black guy's car just for parking near his house. I know, Alone replied, gripping the phone tighter. But David, he doesn't deserve to get caught up in this. I need you to bring the truck as soon as possible. Marcus paused, then said, All right, I'll call the crew. But you've got to be careful, Alone. This town doesn't like folks like us playing hero. Alone nodded, though Marcus couldn't see. I'm not playing hero, he said. I just don't want him to die alone. When the call ended, Alone sank onto the single bed in the shabby motel room, staring out the window. A faint moonlight pierced the dissipating clouds, illuminating his face, tired but unyielding. He thought of David, the old man who dared to stand up for him with a feeble shout. He thought of Jake and the hatred he embodied, a hatred aimed not just at him, but at every black person who dared to live, to exist here. Alone knew tomorrow wouldn't be peaceful. He felt it in the air, in the unnatural silence after the storm. But he also knew he couldn't turn away, not from David and not from himself. In the shed, Jake stood, clapping Billy on the shoulder. Get ready, he said. Tomorrow morning, you'll see how I handle this. The group nodded, their soft laughter rising, but none realized that in the darkness, their whispers weren't just a plan. They were a spark waiting to ignite, ready to burn everything in its path. And at the end of the alley, David sat sleepless, with Duke still growling in the yard, as if both were awaiting something inevitable. Dawn broke over the small Alabama town, but the first light of day brought neither warmth nor hope. After the storm, the sky remained overcast, draped in a thick layer of gray clouds like a leaden curtain, mirroring the heaviness in David's heart. He had stayed awake all night, perched on a worn-out armchair, his hands clutching a thin blanket, as if it were a futile shield against what he sensed was approaching. Duke, the dog, had stopped barking incessantly in the yard around midnight, replaced by an unnatural silence that only deepened his unease. David didn't know exactly what was happening, but his instincts, honed by years of surviving prejudice and threats, were sounding like an unrelenting alarm bell. He rose, shuffling to the window, gazing out at the empty road where the white delivery truck still lay tilted beside the fallen branches. Everything seemed calm, but he knew it was a deceptive facade. A few blocks away, in the dilapidated shed, Jake and his crew were ready. The faint morning light filtered through cracks in the walls, illuminating Jake's flushed face as he checked the gasoline can in his hand. He wore a tattered old jacket, his boots caked with mud from the previous night's storm, but his eyes blazed with a malicious energy. You boys ready? He asked, his voice low and steady, like a commander preparing for battle. Billy, the blonde with a crooked grin, held up a bundle of rags they had already soaked in gasoline. All set, Jake, he replied, his tone eager. One spark, and that old man will run for his life. Another guy, Tommy, smirked. What about that Alone? If he shows up, I'll give him a beating myself. Jake nodded, but he didn't smile. This wasn't about fun for him. It was a statement, a way to reassert the order he believed this town must obey. Alone dared to defy me, he said, gripping the can tighter. I'll show him what happens when you don't know your place. The group murmured in agreement, though a flicker of hesitation crossed the eyes of a few, like Tommy. Burning an old man's house wasn't a game, and even with their deep-seated hatred for black people, the thought of police or the town's outrage gave them pause. But Jake didn't let that hesitation linger. Don't be cowards, he growled when he saw Tommy step back. You want this town to belong to those black bastards? Move or get out. Under Jake's pressure, the group sprang into action. They left the shed, trudging through puddles left by the storm, carrying the gasoline can, rags, and baseball bats like weapons of an undeclared war. The walk to David's house wasn't far, just a few minutes through silent rows of houses where people were either still asleep or pretending not to hear. Jake led the way, striding with the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. He'd done things like this before, smashing cars, intimidating new black arrivals, and had never faced consequences. The local police, mostly white and familiar with his family, usually turn a blind eye. For Jake, this wasn't just revenge. It was a reminder to everyone that in this Alabama, white men still held the power. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Alone Jackson wasn't standing still. After his call with Marcus the night before, he'd left the motel at first light, driving the old truck from the Alabama Community Aid Organization to the volunteers' meeting point. He hadn't slept, his eyes bloodshot with fatigue, but his hands gripped the steering wheel with unshakable resolve. When he reached an empty lot near the old church, Marcus and 3 other volunteers were waiting, 2 black men and a white woman named Sarah, who'd worked with Alone on past relief efforts. "You look like the Walking Dead," Marcus said, his tone half teasing, but his expression turned serious when he saw the urgency on Alone's face. "No time for jokes," Alone replied, his voice low and hurried. "Jake and his crew won't let last night go. I need you all at David's place right now." He recounted the confrontation, Jake raising his bat in threat, the warning this isn't over, and his gut feeling that David was in danger. Sarah, the only white member of the group, frowned. "Jake? That guy trashed my neighborhood last year. He's no joke, Alone." Marcus nodded, adding, "If he's targeting David, it's not just talk. I heard he once burned a warehouse just because the owner was black." Alone clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. "Then we've got to move fast," he said. "I won't let him die because of me." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, his voice firm. "All right, we're with you. But you've got to be careful. Jake doesn't like being challenged, especially by folks like us." Alone nodded without a word, but inside, anger and compassion intertwined into a smoldering fire. He wasn't doing this to prove anything. He was doing it for David, who dared to speak up for him in the storm, and for his belief that a black man had the right to live and help others without punishment. The volunteer group quickly prepared. They loaded the truck with food crates, clothes, and repair tools, originally meant for storm-affected families, now repurposed to aid David. Alone checked the fire extinguisher in the truck, his hand trembling slightly as he considered the worst-case scenario. "If they get there first," he said to Marcus, "we stop them, no matter what." Marcus nodded, but Sarah interjected, "If it comes to a fight, I'll call the cops. I know they don't like us, but it might slow them down." Alone glanced at her, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. As the truck roared to life, its engine shattered the morning silence. Alone sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, his heart heavy with what lay ahead. He didn't know exactly what Jake would do, but he felt the danger in the air, a danger he'd known since his days in Mississippi, watching black folks beaten for daring to hold their heads high. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for David, the old man who'd given him a reason to believe kindness still had a place, even in a town steeped in hatred. In his wooden house, David couldn't sit still any longer. He stood, grabbing an old cane from the corner, a relic from his steel mill days, kept not for defense, but as a memento of stronger times. Now, it was the only thing he could wield if needed. He stepped onto the porch, catching a strange scent in the air, not the damp earth after rain, but something acrid like gasoline. Duke's barking started again, closer and fiercer this time, and David turned just in time to see Jake and his crew emerge at the end of the alley, holding a gasoline can and bundles of rags. "Old man," Jake shouted, his voice echoing down the empty road. "You think you're safe in that rat hole?" He laughed loudly, his crew growling in support. and David felt his heart tighten. He gripped the cane, not to attack. He knew he lacked the strength, but to keep his legs from shaking. "What do you want?" he yelled back, his voice hoarse but not weak. Jake stepped closer, pouring gasoline onto a rag, his eyes gleaming with madness. "I want you, and that alone, to know your place," he said. "And it's not here." Billy stepped forward, striking a match, a small flame flaring in his hand. Jake held the rag toward it, and David felt time slow. He looked at the flame, at the men, and thought of Ella, his wife who'd always told him, "Stand tall, even if the world pushes you down." He didn't run or beg. He stood there, cane in hand, ready to face whatever came. But just then, a rumbling engine roared in the distance, and the headlights of a large truck pierced the morning mist, barreling straight toward David's house. Jake turned, the flame in his hand flickering. "What the hell?" he snarled, but before he could react, the truck screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking his crew from David's house. Alone leapt from the driver's seat, his eyes blazing with a determination Jake had never seen. "Stop!" Alone shouted, his voice overpowering the wind. "You've gone too far." And in that moment, between the flame and the preparations of both sides, a true battle began. The roar of the large truck's engine echoed through the narrow alley, drowning out the lingering wind from last night's storm. Its headlights sliced through the morning mist, shining directly into Jake's flushed face, forcing him to squint for a moment. The small flame on the burning rag in his hand flickered, nearly extinguishing, but Billy quickly shielded it with his hand, keeping it alive. Jake turned, his expression darkening as he saw a lone leap from the driver's seat of the truck marked Alabama Community Aid. "Stop!" Alone shouted, his voice booming, resolute like a declaration of war. "You've gone too far." Behind him, Marcus, Sarah, and two other volunteers stepped down, armed with fire extinguishers, repair tools, and relief supplies, though their eyes betrayed their tension. David stood on his porch, the cane in his hand, trembling slightly, but he didn't back down. He looked at Alone, the black man who'd returned as promised, and felt a flicker of warmth pierce through the fear gripping his heart. Jake and his crew, 5 white men with bats, a gas can, and blazing hatred, faced Alone's group, separated only by the truck blocking the road a few meters away. The air grew thick, as if the entire town held its breath, awaiting the spark that would ignite everything. Jake flashed a cold smile, raising the burning rag higher. "Who do you think you are, ordering me around?" he growled, his voice hoarse with rage. "Bringing this whole crew here to play hero? There's no place for black trash like you here." He glanced at his men, signaling with his eyes, and Billy stepped forward, gripping another baseball bat, his eyes glinting with excitement. "Take it down, Jake!" Billy yelled, his voice a vicious cheer. Tommy and the other 2 advanced, encircling the truck, ready to strike. Alone didn't waver. He stood tall, his broad shoulders taut beneath his storm-soaked shirt, his gaze locked directly on Jake. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low but sharp as steel. "To burn an old man's house just because he's black? Just because I dared to help him?" He pointed at David, still on the porch, now gripping his cane tighter in a silent defiance. "This is his home, where he's lived his whole life. You think you have the right to destroy it?" Jake laughed, but there was no joy in it. Only contempt, the arrogance of a man who believed he held all the power. "His home," he mocked. "This rat hole isn't a home. It's where you people belong, the ones who don't fit here. And you Alone, you think you can waltz in, stir trouble, and pretend you're some saint." He brought the burning rag closer to David's porch, the flames licking the air, the stench of gasoline filling it. "I'll show you the price of defying me." David's heart pounded harder, not for his own fear, but because he realized Alone was putting himself in danger for him. Alone, get out of here, he shouted, his voice raspy but urgent. Don't do this for me. But Alone shook his head, his eyes never leaving Jake. I'm not going anywhere, Mr. David, he said firmly. If we run, they'll never stop. His words stabbed at Jake's pride, twisting his face with fury. He hurled the burning rag toward the porch, the flames erupting as it hit the dry wood near the steps. Burn it! Jake roared, his crew cheering, but Alone sprang into action. He lunged forward, snatched the extinguisher from Marcus, and sprayed it directly at the fire. A loud hiss sounded as white foam smothered the flames before they could spread, leaving only a thin plume of smoke rising from the porch. David coughed from the smoke but stood his ground, staring at Alone with a mix of gratitude and awe. Jake bellowed, charging at Alone with his bat raised high. You're dead, he screamed, but Marcus and Sarah stepped in front of Alone. Stop, Jake, Sarah yelled, her voice cutting through. The police are on their way. Jake froze, lowering the bat slightly. Police, he sneered. They're my buddies, you little white girl. You think they'll touch me? But Sarah didn't flinch. They might be your friends, she shot back, but burning a house in broad daylight with a dozen witnesses? No one can cover that up. She gestured around. Faces had begun to appear at nearby windows, townsfolk roused by the noise and smoke. Jake gritted his teeth, his gaze sweeping over the growing crowd, but he refused to back down. You won't get away, he snarled, signaling his crew to advance. The real battle began. Billy swung his bat at Marcus, but Marcus dodged and shoved him to the ground. Tommy lunged at Alone, but Alone was faster, grabbing his arm and twisting it until the bat clattered to the road. Sarah rushed to David, pulling him inside to shield him from the chaos, while the other two volunteers used repair tools to block Jake's crew. Shouts, thuds, and the clang of metal filled the air, mingling with distant vehicle sounds, perhaps the police or just a stray car. But to Alone, it didn't matter. He wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to protect David, to prove Jake's hatred couldn't extinguish compassion. Seeing his men falter, Jake roared in frustration. He charged Alone, swinging his bat at his head. Alone dodged by a hair, but the blow grazed his shoulder, making him stagger in pain. You don't belong here. Jake screamed, his voice breaking with madness. I'll make you disappear. But before he could strike again, David emerged from the porch, raising his cane. Enough, he shouted, his voice hoarse but powerful. He didn't hit Jake. He lacked the strength. But the act startled Jake, who turned, stunned by the resilience of the old man he'd dismissed. That moment halted everything. Jake's crew stepped back, panting, while Alone's group rallied around him, ready to continue if needed. Jake looked around. The smoke from the extinguished fire, the growing crowd, and the now audible police sirens in the distance. He clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with hatred, but he knew he couldn't go on. This isn't over, he growled, throwing his bat to the ground. You'll regret this. He signaled his crew to retreat, stalking off with wounded pride, leaving the alley in a mix of chaos and eerie calm. Alone panted, his shoulder throbbing, but he turned to David, still standing with his cane. You okay? He asked, his tone softening. David nodded, tears streaming down his face, not from fear, but from emotion. Thank you, Alone, he said, his voice trembling. You saved me. Alone gave a faint, weary but genuine smile. We saved each other, he replied, resting a hand lightly on David's shoulder. The volunteer group began cleaning up, bringing food crates and clothes from the truck into David's house, repairing the scorched porch, and clearing the remaining storm debris. Townsfolk watched from windows and porches, their expressions a mix of surprise, shame, and lingering hostility. But to David, that no longer mattered. He looked at Alone, directing the volunteers, and felt a spark of hope he'd long lost. Jake might return, the hatred might persist, but today, amid the flames and the fight, he knew he wasn't alone. When the police finally arrived, two white officers with sour faces, they scribbled a few notes and left, making no arrests, asking no questions. Black folks mess, one muttered to his partner, and they smirked before driving off. But Alone didn't care. He stood beside David, watching the patrol car disappear, and said, "They don't need to understand." "We do." David nodded, still clutching his cane. But now it was no longer a weapon. It was a symbol of the resilience he and Alone had upheld together. As the police car disappeared around the bend at the end of the road, leaving a faint trail of dust in the morning air, the small Alabama town seemed to settle back into its usual stillness. But it was only surface deep. In the narrow alley before David's house, traces of the confrontation lingered. The scorched wood on the porch, gasoline-soaked rags scattered across the street, and the white delivery truck now pulled aside thanks to the volunteers' efforts. David stood on the porch, his cane propped against the wall, his eyes watching Alone and the others clean up with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. The thundering of his heartbeat from when Jake had raised the flame was gone, but the tension clung to him, a shadow that refused to leave. Alone wiped sweat from his brow, his shoulders still aching from Jake's glancing blow, though he paid it no mind. He directed Marcus and Sarah to carry food crates into David's house, while the other two volunteers shoveled away the remaining storm debris. The townsfolk began to gather in greater numbers. No longer just faces peeking through windows, but people stepping onto porches, standing at street corners, whispering among themselves. Some eyes remained cold, still carrying the hostility David and Alone knew well, but others were different, surprised, curious, even ashamed. An elderly white woman, Mrs. Mary from the house across the street, shuffled out with trembling hands, looked at Alone, and said, "You did good, son. I didn't think it'd go this far." Alone nodded without a word, but the faint smile on his lips told her he harbored no resentment. David stepped down from the porch, his legs still weak, but steadier than he'd expected. He approached Alone, placing a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture weighted with meaning. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice raspy but warm. "You could have walked away, left me to handle it." Alone turned, meeting David's gaze with rare sincerity in his eyes. "I couldn't do that, Mr. David," he replied. "If I walked away, it'd be like letting them win. And you don't deserve to face that alone." Tears welled in David's eyes, not from sorrow, but from realizing that, for the first time in years, he was no longer an invisible figure in this town. The volunteer group pressed on, transforming David's weathered wooden house into a small hub of support. They brought in crates of food, rice, dried beans, bread, and a few warm clothes Sarah had gathered from the church. Marcus repaired the porch, hammering nails into the charred boards to reinforce them, while Alone checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were sturdy enough to withstand any future threats. David sat in his armchair, watching the scene with an odd sensation, as if his home, once a place of solitude and silence, was coming back to life through the hands of people he'd never thought would care. But not everyone in town softened. Jake, though he'd retreated, hadn't vanished entirely. From a distance, he stood at a street corner with Billy and Tommy, his eyes still blazing with hatred as he watched Alone's group work. "They think they've won," he growled, clenching his fists. "I'll be back, and next time, no one's saving them." Billy nodded eagerly, but Tommy took a step back, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Jake, maybe we should stop," he said quietly. "The cops showed up. People saw everything." Jake spun around, slapping Tommy hard across the face. sending him sprawling. "You coward," he shouted. "Those black bastards don't belong here, and I won't let them forget it." Tommy bowed his head, silent, but inside, a seed of doubt had begun to sprout. Meanwhile, Alone and the charity group's presence started to ripple outward. A young white boy, the son of a nearby family, ran up with his mother in tow, tugging her hand and saying, "Mom, they're helping Mr. David. I want to help too." The mother, a stern-faced white woman, looked at her son, then at David and Alone. She hesitated, but finally nodded, letting the boy bring a sack of potatoes from their home to place at David's door. "Thank you, kid," David said gently, and the boy beamed before running back. The mother lingered, her eyes meeting Alone's, and she gave a slight nod, not a grand acknowledgement, but a small step in a town riddled with divides. As the sun climbed higher, the volunteers finished their work. David's house was not only repaired but stocked with essentials, enough to sustain him for months without worry. Alone stood beside him, surveying the scene with quiet satisfaction. "You going to be okay?" he asked. David nodded, then grasped Alone's hand, pulling him closer. "You saved me," he said, his voice trembling. "Not just from the fire, but from loneliness. I don't know how to thank you." Alone smiled, his first real smile of the day. "You gave me a reason not to give up," he replied. "That's enough." That evening, as the volunteers departed, Alone stayed a little longer. He and David sat on the porch, watching the sky clear after days of storms. The first stars twinkled faintly above, fragile but persistent, like lights piercing the darkness. David fetched an old radio from inside, turning it on, and the sound of gospel music filled the air, a song Ella, his late wife, had loved. He sat listening, feeling as if Ella were smiling at him from somewhere far away. Alone sat beside him, silent, but his presence was enough for David to know he wasn't alone. The town didn't transform entirely after that day. Jake still lurked somewhere, his schemes not yet dissolved, and many white folks still eyed David and Alone with suspicion. But something had shifted. David's house became a modest haven for those in need. Not just black people, but poor white families who began seeking help from Alone and the charity group. The boy with the potatoes returned a few times, bringing friends, and slowly, a small community formed around the weathered wooden house. It wasn't grand or perfect, but it was real. A week later, Alone sat with David on the porch, watching a group of kids, black and white, play in the street ahead, laughing without heed to the boundaries adults had built. "How long do you think this will last?" David asked, his tone pensive. Alone looked at him, then at the children, and said, "I don't know. But as long as we don't stop, it won't fade away." David nodded, resting a hand on Alone's shoulder, and they sat there, amid the ashes of the past and the new light of the future. From afar, Jake watched the scene, his face shadowed with rage. He didn't act yet, but the hatred in him still burned. This time, though, he wasn't alone in his anger. Tommy had left, and a few others from his crew began avoiding him. Change didn't come swiftly or easily, but it had begun. For David and Alone, that was a victory, not one of vengeance, but of compassion and resilience. As night fell, David turned on the radio again, and Ella's song drifted into the air. He closed his eyes, smiling, and for the first time in years, he felt he truly belonged here. Not because the town accepted him, but because of Alone, who'd stood up for him, and because of himself, who hadn't given up. The ashes of yesterday had cooled, but a new light, however small, flickered on, promising a different tomorrow. The story of David and Alone, set in a small Alabama town, stands as a powerful testament to the strength of compassion in overcoming seemingly insurmountable barriers. David, an elderly black American living in isolation from his community, and Alone, a young engineer driven by a desire to live kindly, found each other during a stormy night, both literally and figuratively. When Alone stopped to rescue a stranded delivery truck and faced hostility from Jake and his group of white men, he didn't just save the deliverman, he also ignited a spark of hope in David's heart. His actions weren't driven by a need for recognition, but by a deep-seated belief that helping others is inherently right, regardless of race or circumstance. This unconditional compassion became a flame that warmed frozen souls, demonstrating that even in the darkest moments, a single act of kindness can illuminate hope. The stark contrast between kindness and hatred is vividly portrayed throughout the narrative. Jake embodies a deeply ingrained racist mindset within the town, a belief that black people don't belong and must be expelled to preserve a so-called order. His actions, from threatening Alone in the storm to plotting to burn David's house, reflect a fear and insecurity toward those who dare to challenge the authority he assumes. In contrast, Alone and David don't respond with violence or bitterness. They choose to stand up, protect each other, and build something good from the ashes. Kindness here is not just a personal act, but a bold statement against injustice. The lesson is that compassion can be a more potent weapon than aggression, as it not only defends but also inspires others. Resilience in the face of adversity is a core value the story conveys. David, though old and alone, didn't flee when Jake threatened to torch his home. He stood on his porch, cane in hand, ready to confront his fate. Alone, fully aware he was a target of hatred, didn't abandon David, even rallying a charity group to safeguard him. This resilience isn't blind defiance, but an inner strength fueled by self-worth and empathy for others. In life, when facing hardship, resilience doesn't just help us survive, it can alter how others perceive us. The courage of David and Alone prompted some townsfolk to reconsider their prejudices, however slowly that change unfolded. The harsh reality of racism is a theme the story doesn't shy away from. Jake and his crew aren't mere villains. They represent a systemic ideology entrenched in this Alabama town, where black people are deemed outsiders despite being born and raised there. From Jake's insults like, "You don't belong here," to the police's indifference at the scene, the narrative exposes how racial prejudice isn't just individual acts, but a societal structure sustained by silence and complicity. Even in 2025, the story setting, this issue hasn't fully vanished, reminding us that racism is a deep wound requiring time and effort to heal. The takeaway is that we can't pretend the problem doesn't exist. Confronting and acting upon it is the only path forward. Though the story doesn't end in total triumph, Jake remains, hatred still simmers. It reveals small, tangible shifts in the community. David's house becomes a support hub not just for black residents, but also for struggling white families, and children begin playing together across racial lines. An elderly white woman expresses gratitude to Alone. A boy brings potatoes for David. These small acts are seeds of change, insufficient to erase prejudice entirely, but significant nonetheless. Change doesn't come swiftly or easily, but it starts in moments like these, when people are willing to cross their own boundaries to connect. In life, we learn that small, imperfect steps can create a ripple effect greater than we imagine. The friendship between David and Alone is the story's heart, showcasing the power of solidarity in overcoming loneliness and hatred. David, once isolated, finds a friend in Alone, someone who not only saved him from the fire but restored his sense of belonging. Alone, despite facing discrimination and danger, finds purpose in David, the old man who stood up for him in the storm. Their bond isn't built on gain or grandeur, but on mutual understanding and genuine compassion. The life lesson here is that friendship, even forged in hardship, can be our greatest strength, enabling us to face challenges we couldn't tackle alone. Jake's presence serves as a reminder that hatred doesn't vanish easily. Though thwarted in burning David's house, he plots a return, and part of the town still shares his views. Yet the story also shows that hatred isn't invincible. Tommy's departure from Jake's crew, the involvement of a few white townsfolk in aiding David, and the laughter of children playing together signal that prejudice can waver. In life, we learn that not all foes change, but persistence and kindness can erode their power bit by bit. The key is not to give up, even when victory is fleeting. The community's role in the story invites reflection. Initially, the townsfolk stood on the sidelines, watching alone and David battle Jake through closed windows. But after the clash, some stepped forward, not to oppose Jake, but to offer modest help. This shows that communities aren't always united or just, but they can evolve when confronted with compassion and resilience. The lesson is that each person bears responsibility, not to transform the world, but to contribute to small changes around them. Silence abets hatred, but action, however minor, can make a difference. The gospel music from David's old radio at the story's end symbolizes hope and timeless connection. It evokes Ella, David's late wife, giving him a sense that he's not just surviving, but living meaningfully. For Alone, it's a moment of peace amid days of struggle, a reminder that his efforts aren't in vain. In life, small symbols, a song, a smile, a handshake, can become anchors motivating us to press on despite a thorny path. Hope isn't grand or certain. It's the faint glimmers we must hold onto ourselves. Ultimately, the story teaches that life is a series of battles, not just with external foes like Jake, but with loneliness, fear, and inner biases. David and Alone don't eradicate racism, but they triumph in preserving their humanity and inspiring others. The greatest lesson is that we don't need to change the world to find meaning. Sometimes, standing up for one person, refusing to yield to hatred, is enough to plant seeds of goodness. In a society still divided by race, the story reminds us that compassion and resilience can bridge gaps, however fragile, bringing people closer. The Alabama town doesn't become a paradise overnight, but it's no longer a place where David feels entirely unseen. Alone doesn't become a hero to all, but he becomes the friend David needed most. Change doesn't flood in like a torrent, but seeps like droplets into parched earth, slow, patient, unstoppable. In our lives, the final lesson is to live with compassion, stand firm against injustice, and believe that even in darkness, a small light can endure and spread. David and Alone did it, and so can we.